Good afternoon, everyone. Hello and welcome to today's Portland State University Transportation Seminar, formerly known as the Friday Transportation Seminar. My name is Jennifer Dill, and I'll be introducing and moderating today's seminar. Our PSU Transportation Seminars have been a tradition since the year 2000. Though today's seminar is virtual only, these seminars are often held live on Portland State University's urban campus located on the ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, and Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge that we are here because of the sacrifices forced on the indigenous ancestors of this place, remember these communities, and honor their legacy, lives, and descendants. Today, we are very pleased to have Dr. Tara Goddard presenting on transportation safety culture, where we are and what it means. Tara Goddard is an assistant professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Urban Planning at Texas A&M University. After earning a master's degree in civil engineering from UC Davis, she worked as an associate transportation planner for the city of Sacramento, and then from 2007 to 2011 served as the bicycle pedestrian program coordinator for the city of Davis, California. Realizing she was a research geek at heart, Dr. Goddard returned to school and earned her PhD in urban studies at Portland State University. Very proud of that. She joined the faculty at Texas A&M in 2017, where her research focuses on transportation safety, particularly the interactions of transportation culture, behavior, and infrastructure on differential experiences and safety outcomes for people who walk and wheel. Before we start the talk, I just want to announce a couple upcoming NHTSA webinars. On February 23rd, we have two colleagues from Oregon Tech talking about improving recreational trail accessibility with volcanic ash treatment. And then in March, we have Phil Stoker from University of Arizona on planning and development in gateway communities post-COVID. A quick overview of today's seminar. You can expect our speaker to present for about 40 minutes, followed by Q&A, and we ask that you type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can type them in at any time, but we will hold them to the end. If we run out of time, we will share the questions with our speaker. We have enabled closed captioning, but you must click on the CC feature on your control panel to view them. And we are recording today's seminar, and the recording and the slides will be available later today on our website. And if you're tracking professional development hours, the information is there. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Tara.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer. I will share my screen. Great. Should be good to go?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me. And I just want to say that I am zooming in from College Station, Texas, on the traditional lands of the Takawa and Santa people. I would have loved to be with you all, those of you who are in Portland, but it made sense. I didn't feel I'd be walking my climate talk if I came all the way for a 1-hour talk from Texas, but I do miss Portland very much. So as you can see here, I'm going to be talking about transportation safety culture, and I'm really going to be focusing today on how it manifests and how it affects professional planning and engineering in particular. And these images I chose on the left here, I think it's so indicative of our traffic safety issues in the US in particular, that this even exists, this baby on board placard, that we felt we needed to appeal to people in particular that, please be safe, I have a baby here. And then this other picture is a sticker I took a picture at some point, adults on board, we want to live too. So I thought those were good. Let's get this started here. Okay. And I wanted to start this off. I know it's a lot of text, but I'm going to go ahead and read this whole thing as a content warning. So I say here that during this webinar, I will discuss information and statistics about injuries and fatalities related to traffic crashes, including examples of culture related to violence. There are no graphic images, and I attempt to present all of this with care and with the intention to avoid evoking trauma for the many listeners and viewers who experience traffic violence themselves or among family, friends, colleagues, neighbors, and pets. When I do use humor, memes, or satire, is with the intention to punch up, push the powerful for change, and not to be glib about the very real emotional, mental, and physical costs of this public health crisis. I've been presenting on traffic safety stats and this type of work for 15 years or more, and I realized that I never really talk about or give any kind of warning on this, and I really should, because it's a big deal and it affects those of us who do this work and certainly all the people that we talk to and work with. Okay, so because I'm going to cover a lot of topics, and I'm going to do it in a fairly short amount of time, I just wanted to give you a path forward about where we're going. So I'm going to talk about just one slide of the stats, because if you're here today, you're probably pretty aware of the problem. I'm going to talk about what is largely an American issue around our cars and the other aspects of culture that it's entangled with, and some of those obvious egregious examples. And then a little bit of what I see as the debate between individuals versus systems, and what I think we need to talk about of systems of individuals, talking about car culture and windshield bias, and what I'm recommending as some maybe shared definitions. And then particularly the way those manifest in planning and engineering at multiple levels of agencies, which has a lot more subtle examples, but I think have a lot more effect on maybe why we're not moving forward in certain ways, or things that suggest ways we can move forward. And then I'm really hoping to leave lots of time for discussion and Q&A. I know there's already questions that have come in. I'm looking forward to that. And for anyone who knows me, they know brevity is not my strong suit, and this is a very important topic to me, but I'm really hoping to stay on target, as anyone with Star Wars knowledge knows that's where the meme comes from. Okay, for today, my goals are not to necessarily get us to all disagree, right? We have lots of different viewpoints. You're going to fall in a different place on whether we should be talking about individuals or systems. And healthy conflict in the profession is good. We have different roles to play, whether it's in agencies or advocates, writers, researchers. And these problems aren't just complicated, they're complex. That means they're interconnected. They a lot of times can't be extricated from each other. And so we need a lot of approaches. But I do think it's really important for us to be self-reflective as practitioners in particular, to have some shared definitions. I do want to talk about some of the dialogue that I think can hold us back or split us up. And really, I'm hoping to spark some discussion that carries us forward. So I don't usually do this, but I think it's important in this talk. I call it my bona fides, that I can talk about both planners and engineers. And I know Jennifer gave my bio, but I'm just highlighting these again, because I want to head off any criticism that engineers can feel like they get picked on, and planners too, but particularly engineers. And I have worked, I have a master's in engineering, and I've worked closely with engineers. Even when I've worked as a planner, it's been within engineering departments, essentially. So I do have a lot of insight and experience, and I, as an educator, teach almost equal numbers of planners and engineers. So I think it's fair to say that, I both am critical of both, but also is because I want to demand better of both sides. Okay, so on to the stat with the really dire numbers. And again, if you're here, you're probably pretty aware of it, but I do think it's important to ground us in this. And this is one of those slides that I want to acknowledge is both incredibly disturbing and traumatic, but also it masks so much more trauma and is easy to kind of miss the bigger picture. So we know we have an ongoing public health crisis. The number of fatalities and injuries in traffic crashes, we know we've had an alarming rise. And we know that, of course, fatalities don't just affect the people that are killed, but the families and friends and colleagues. Injuries, not just severe, but even moderate or minor, quote unquote, minor injuries can have huge lifelong effects. Chair Hamidi was speaking, in a recent podcast about, the mental effects and emotional long-term effects of even pretty minor crashes. So these are all significant things that sometimes can get even kind of obscured when we rattle off these statistics. And some of these numbers, we saw going up with COVID as fewer people were on the road, more empty roads, maybe more speeding, but then also less seatbelt or lower seatbelt use, increase in drinking. really alarming rise in pedestrians being killed. But then also, what's important for this talk about whether we should be focusing on drivers and individuals is even as traffic volumes have gone back up, we've seen an increase in, or a continued increase, or certainly increase, or excuse me, continued high number in these, per mileage death rates. So it's not just a built environment issue, right? It's not just empty roads. And I do want to draw attention on the National Safety Council. On their website, when they talked about this per mileage death rate, they say it was 16.5% higher than pre-COVID normal in 2019. And I left that phrase in there because that's one of those ways that I think we subtly just normalize this to even call it a pre-COVID normal of these huge death numbers. Okay, so just a quick reminder, this is a very simplified argument when people talk about, oh, that old and incorrectly cited idea of like, oh, all traffic crashes or 94% of traffic crashes are driver error, which plenty of other people have debunked or talked about. I'm not going to go into too much here, but versus the safe systems approach. And this diagram is from Vision Zero. I still think one of the best, simplest write-ups about Vision Zero and safe systems is from the Vision Zero network, the Vision Zero Cities Journal, and I have the link there at the bottom of the slide that'll be available later. If you haven't looked at it, it was in the Vision Zero Cities Journal and also a Medium post. So anyways, on the left side there, you have this traditional approach where traffic deaths are inevitable. They're just part of the doing business. So we need to have perfect human behavior, it's individual responsibility, et cetera. And then safe systems and Vision Zero that we need to integrate human failing, prevent fatal and severe crashes, et cetera. And so I think those are important to understand, but also it is kind of a simplified way to understand that. And I think we need to be talking about a more nuanced approach. And I want to talk about why I think that is with drivers. Okay, so here's some ways that I think the idea of drivers make mistakes and drivers have failings. We do forget about all the ways that we as drivers make a lot of choices. So these are a few photos I took in well, I wasn't driving, I was a passenger, in 5 minutes here in College Station, right? So I originally obscured their faces, but I don't think it's even worth it anymore. So cell phone use is a huge problem, and it is a choice. And we can talk lots about whether the environment makes people feel like it's unlikely they're going to crash while doing it. That's a valid thing, but it's still a choice that people make. And I think if you asked people, they're pretty aware that it's not ideal to do it, but it is a choice. And interestingly, it's not a choice everywhere, as I've observed when I've been in other places. So there are signals to drivers, and maybe it's hands-free laws or enforcement, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But again, it's not something inevitable that just happens. Which brings me to this. Unfortunately, we're not in person, and I can't even see you all. But I have an Android phone, and I use cell phone driving mode. And if I was there, I would ask you, or if I could see you, I'd ask you to raise your hands, whether you use your cell phone driving mode. So these are a few screenshots that show how it looks and how it works. So as soon as my car turns on and my cell phone connects, most of my apps are unusable. I do not use this because I am a saint or I'm a better person than most people. I use it because I'm just as tempted as anyone else to pick up my phone. I'm just as twitchy reaching for my phone when, oh, guess what? It's already in my hand. I use it to keep myself from doing it. What I would be curious is, do you use it? If not, would you pledge to start doing it? And if I checked back in with you, would you still have it on in 6 months, or would you have turned it off because it's pretty annoying, right? But again, we make choices as drivers. Here's some of those egregious examples I've talked about with American car culture, right? So, and this is where I'd love to hear from my international colleagues. I've traveled internationally quite a bit. I haven't seen anything like this in other countries. Maybe it exists, maybe in some way we've infected other countries with this. On the top left there, you see an image of 2 giant nuts. So those are truck nuts hanging down. Real men use 3 pedals, so implying that an automatic isn't as manly to drive. Middle is an article from the Atlantic about how climate, consciousness and electric vehicles aren't manly. And then this article from Bloomberg with the Ford CEO, saying to Elon that Ford's electric vehicle is a real truck. And Alyssa Walker in LA just did a whole great thread about Super Bowl ads and an article about EVs and masculinity. But also motherhood, right? We have these weird signifiers about motherhood and vehicles. So most of the pictures and things in this talk I've taken, unless I mark it otherwise. So this one on the top left, I'm not drunk, I'm passing snacks and whooping ass parent life. You know, so there's a little bit of like child abuse joke in there at the same time, and drinking, and it's a whole lot of things. The Momster truck, and then my all-time favorite Geico commercial where this woman doesn't have her car, so she's running down with an air horn and a bumper sticker on the back of her skirt, and then her kid pretends not to know her. So, and then crashes involving alcohol. With all the great work Matt has done, it's still this huge problem, high number of crashes and fatalities with alcohol, and they're increasing again. And yet we have things like this Hop Toddy Burger Bar is a local chain, and they have the roadie bag. I didn't even know what a roadie was till I moved here, which is maybe funny because I did grow up in a rural place and apparently that was a thing too. But 64 ounces of a to-go bag of margarita mix, right? And then even this phrase they use in the ad, buzzworthy gift, haha, right? And yet we know buzz drinking is terrible. And then we have these drive-through daiquiri barns where you can buy, half a gallon of drink and Jello shots for $23. And I just don't know if this is something that even exists in other countries, or if, this is all these ways that we kind of normalize and bring together cars and other problematic cultures. And then cars and guns, right? So we have cars and bullets. We have the sticker I saw on someone's, that's supposed to look like the Starbucks. I love guns and coffee. Down below, these colors don't run, they reload. These are car stickers. So it's significant that people aren't just putting these stickers on a water bottle or on their bag or something. They're putting them on their cars. It's very much linked. This one that was at a medical office here in town, I think it's an employee because it's there all the time, where, guns, and also it's pink. So it's like, I'm violent and also I'm feminine, right? So really kind of interesting signifiers all put together. And unfortunately, this isn't just performative, right? In 2021, someone was shot or wounded in either wounded or killed, in a road rage incident every 17 hours in the United States. And here in Texas, where we have permitless carry, you do not even need to show that you have any competence or understanding of a gun to own and carry a gun now. 133 injuries and deaths in the year. And you can see the graph there from every town about how it's not just a problem, but it's getting worse. So again, bringing together road rage, anger on the road. And then just generally jokes about violence against others on the road. So the nobody cares about your stick figure, where you see someone's truck is running over, not just a family, but like a kid and someone pushing a stroller. And then Max Wilson on Twitter showed this one that he took recently, someone tick marks of how many people they've run over. And I raised the question here, is this the end of the supermarket analogy, right? So I and many others, and Ian Walker recently used this analogy on the War on Cars podcast, where you say, well, you do things behind the wheel you'd never do in the supermarket because of all these unique things about cars, right? We're in our carcoon, we're de-individualized from people, we're isolated from people, and those things are all true. But I do think the last few years with COVID have shown us like a lot of people are willing to do things in person that they are willing to do in the supermarket. On the right here, I have a picture of Betty Soskin. If you don't know who she is, look her up. She's an amazing, one of the longest serving park rangers. And I use her because not that long ago, I was in a national park office in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and someone was yelling at the lovely elderly park ranger ladies about being sheep because they told them they had to wear masks. And it was just shocking to me because all of a sudden it was one of those moments of like, oh, the gloves are off, right? Like people are doing things. And so I do think there is something we need to separate between people, making mistakes, or people kind of being like, oh, I'm driving fast because the road's wide and it just feels like I should drive fast. And all the people making choices. And it's not just a few bad apples. I agree with this idea that it's, oh, not just a few bad apples. We just need to take those few bad drivers. It's a whole lot of us behaving badly on the road. So this is why I think that, saying it's only the road design is inaccurate, in addition to the things I've been talking about. We know through multiple studies that holding the built environment constant drivers don't behave equally around all people, especially when those people are walking or biking. Lots of you are familiar with the study that Ian Walker did with when the bicyclist appears female or is wearing a helmet or not. PIF and the others in San Francisco, the driver's in a fancier car. My colleagues and I in Portland, whether the pedestrian was a Black man, the folks in Las Vegas, whether the pedestrian was a Black woman, and then people were less likely to stop when they were walking in a higher income neighborhood. And then also my own research here at Texas A&M, when the driver, we did a driving simulator when the driver had implicit subconscious biases in favor of drivers over bias. And that's when the built environment doesn't change. Drivers are doing different things based on the identity of the people. And why focusing only on road design is also insufficient. All right, so fixing the environment is slow. If we're like, oh, it's all about road design, we're going to keep losing 40,000 people a year, right? Or lots and lots of people, because it's going to take a long time, particularly here in Texas, where just the sheer amount of concrete and roads we have is huge. And certainly hardscape infrastructure can't solve all problems all places, especially if you're talking about the cheaper, quicker fixes like bollards and, you know, islands and refuges and things like that. So we also need to be talking about automated enforcement and changes to liability. And I'm not talking about just for individuals, I'm talking, or maybe especially for things like automakers, and changes to our insurance systems, certainly changes to licensing and training renewal, and changes to automotive and digital technologies, which I talk a lot about and I'm studying now and doing research on, which is not a focus of the talk today. They're faster logistically, if not politically, but they also need to be done within a justice framework, right? So they need to be done in such a way that we're not just perpetuating or worsening inequities on certain communities. And I also think focusing only on road design is reductive, because we should be de-emphasizing mistakes, but we are obscuring choices. So people have agency and drivers have the most power on the road. And I welcome anyone to come and spend a week with me here in Texas. I have a spare bedroom. You can stay with me and spend some time with me driving around and see if you aren't changed or aren't feeling a little bit more radicalized about all the ways that people are making the conscious choice to drive badly in a way that is just selfish and endangering others. And I don't think they're just responding to the fact that, like, you know, the road is wire. More importantly, perhaps, I think focusing on, you know, not focusing on individuals means that, like, we're kind of obscuring that systems are made up of individuals. So we can't just hand wave and say, oh, we just need to change the systems. Well, in order to change the systems, we have to change all these individuals that are, you know, making up and have the power in the systems. And I think, you know, our research, what I've done with like Kelsey Ralph and Calvin Thigpen and Evan Ikabuchi and others, you know, has shown, and many other people, like, language matters. So we have to be really intentional that we don't give powerful people and ourselves as practitioners a path by just pointing to the systems. Now you could say I'm being a little reductive, right? Because when people say, oh, don't focus on individuals, like, they're not just saying road design, but I do see that conflated, which is why I wanted to draw attention to it. So, you know, when you look at a full Vision Zero or safe systems approach, it does look at the many aspects, not just the built environment, that are needed. And I wanted to draw attention. I really appreciated that, again, Chair Hamidi, chair of the NTSB, was talking about this in her recent, I think it was a podcast with ITE, that even though the National Road Safety Strategy highlights safe roads as one of its tenets, it's really about safe infrastructure. So we know that riding transit is so much safer than being on the road at all, for example. And the more people you get on transit, the fewer people you might have on the road. So really, it's not just about making our streets and roads safer. It's like the whole infrastructure picture. So I wanted to highlight that because I thought that was a really good point. But also, when we're talking about the systems and safe systems, we're not just talking about the road system or the built environment system. And like I said, this is, I know I keep making a big deal out of this, but like improv, I think it needs to be a yes and, right? We need to be talking about these. And this is where I'm making a little bit of a hot take, and I welcome the discussion and debate on this. I think when we talk about mistakes or failings, it still is a bit like accidents. And I know, like in my own research, when you ask people whether they, you know, think of themselves as a skilled driver, like 93% of people said, I'm yes, either strongly or agree that I'm a skilled driver. So I don't make mistakes. Failings don't happen to me. But like also most people were willing to admit that they'd like yelled, honked, cut someone off, or done these bad things. So I do hypothesize, and I would like to look at this in research, whether building support for systemic change might actually be more about talking about the way that we behave badly, which we are kind of willing to admit, and we might need to be, rather than just saying, oh, well, we're trying to save people from mistakes and failings. So that's an open question, but why I do think it's worth still talking about individuals. I do want to say a caveat about individuals and the legacy of enforcement in our profession. So I don't want us to confuse vengeance with justice. Armed traffic enforcement is unequivocally dangerous, particularly for racialized communities. We as traffic safety professionals need to confront our history and our current participation in the carceral system. And all that's way too much for today's talk. So I really hope that many of us or more of us join the ongoing conversations that groups like Equiticity and others are leading about this. So I want to make it clear that in my talking about focusing on individuals, I am not making a case that we're doing a punitive enforcement approach. And one other thing I do want to point out, just as a little bit of a side interesting note. So this is a graph from the research, the experiment that I did, again, with Dr. Ralph, Dr. Thigpen, Dr. Ayubukji, where we showed people the different versions of an article, a crash report between a driver and pedestrian, and asked people about what happened. This is a piece that we've really talked about and has gotten the least amount of attention that I think is incredibly fascinating and is an example of car culture, is when we ask them, all right, imagine a driver is in the story that in this crash was on trial, what's an appropriate punishment? And this is how it varied, which article type they saw. And the ones with a circle, there was a statistical significant difference. But what was really interesting is the least amount of support really for any of the types was a vehicle impound. People were more willing to give jail time, really in any of the cases, than they were vehicle impound. And you could say, well, maybe that's because, rightly so, in most of our culture, people really know that, God, you have to get a car to get around. And that is true, the way we built our environment. But also, I think that it is this completely internalized idea that the car is just part of our society. And yet jail time is something we're willing to mete out. So I think that's going to be something worth exploring more in the future. Okay. So that was a lot. I just wanted to give us a little bit of a break, take a breath. A lot of serious topic. These are my nieces, my sister and I out with them on bike ride. On the right there is my sister and I, these many years ago, out on the lovely Biz Johnson Trail, a rail to trail facility in Northern California. Okay, so now we're going to move into the second bit, which is really focusing on us, right? This is focused on the profession. So like I said, why I think the other big piece of this, of thinking about individuals, is that systems are made of individuals and individuals with power. That's the important piece of this. So in order to change these systems, we have to change us. And I wanted to just go over a few ways that I see this car culture and windshield bias manifesting in our profession. So a few definitions, and I know I'm getting to the definitions a little bit late, but it just made more sense this way. So this is not new. I'm in no way the first person to advance some of these definitions, but this is John Urry in the just phenomenal book, Mobilities. I highly recommend it if you haven't read it, from 2007. And I think the term came earlier. I don't know who originally coined the term, Peter Norton or Ian Walker, somebody can correct me where it came from first, but he says it's unique for its specific character of domination, and the car is a way of life and not just a transport system for getting from one place to another. So here's my definitions. Again, this is a lot of text, I apologize, but I want to be clear to differentiate it between hobby cars, people with big fancy trucks, and what someone might say, oh, that's a silly suspension system and lights. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the system of norms, beliefs, behaviors, and practices that result from setting the automobile as the default mode and allocating majority of funding, land use, safety tech, messaging, etc., in favor of automobile and at the expense of people who choose or must use other modes. And then, you hear me talk about this idea of windshield bias. So car culture both causes and relies on windshield bias, which is a way of thinking that views car culture as correct and appropriate and justifies its facets and or impedes the ability to see other potential systems or ways of being. And I think this is an important piece too. People perceive criticism of their bias as a criticism of their self-identity and thus respond defensively and out of proportion. So it's not just like, I'm criticizing your use of a hammer or a toothbrush, right? It's something much more deeply embedded. And then many of you may be familiar with the study that Dr. Walker and his colleagues did recently with this they coined this term motonormativity, kind of riffing off of, say, heteronormativity. They showed how society excuses public health hazards from automobiles far beyond things like smoking, so emissions from cars versus smoking secondhand. But what's really a key takeaway from that study is not just, or a point they made, not just that like generally society we do this, but it's endemic among professionals in government and in this case the medical profession. And so then as policymakers it's neglected. So people within these roles need to recognize these biases and find ways to root it out in the profession. So I just think that's a really key piece that they made. So I'm just making sure that I'm staying on time, which is why I'm looking at my phone. Okay, so what I call windshield bias, and Dr. Walker talks about, he references David Hume's is-ought fallacy, which is this idea that we look around at the way things is, and think that's the way they ought to be. And that is, again, this windshield bias impedes us from seeing things different. And as I like to say, like, it's not a static system. It continually has to be performed and upheld, especially the more it's contested. And for us as practitioners, that means, in the policies we adopt, in the programs we do, in the concrete we lay down, et cetera. And so when it's so dominant, literally and kind of culturally, any trade-off feels like an attack. And anybody who's worked on like even just a little bike lane project or removing a couple parking spots or daylighting an intersection gets this, right? The backlash just feels so outsized sometimes to the size of the project, but it gets at this dominance of the system. But again, it's something we do, not something that is. But even understanding this culture among, within ourselves and among the profession can be really challenging. So this is from David Foster Wallace's famous commencement speech, where he talks about this older fish who says, morning boys, how's the water? And the younger fish say, well, what the hell's water? This idea that when you're in it, you don't even see it. But I found this other comic, which I actually think is an even better version of his point, where it's a dog is asking how's the water to the fish, and the point of this is the David Foster Wallace example makes it seem like the older, wiser fish, which David Foster Wallace made clear that he didn't think he was the older, wiser fish, could see the water. And I think that's a real challenge that even managers and higher level people in, say, our organizations and in our profession, they also are in the culture. We are also in the culture. And so it's hard for us to see that we're also we're also subject to this windshield bias. And while this is all going on, of course, like, these are memes I created with apologies to people who are good at making memes. Big oil and auto manufacturers and tech companies are blazing ahead with selling us things that aren't as safe as they say they are. And focusing on user interfaces instead of actual safety tech. And I've been very quiet for the most part about criticizing NHTSA, partly because I would really love to get access to more of their data and I don't want to piss people off. And of course, with all this, there's lots of really good meaning, well-intentioned people at all these organizations, but as larger systems, it's not enough. So this is from the CDC injury prevention page. I just want to give a few more examples. Focus on pedestrians. This idea that you can keep yourself safe as a pedestrian is this pervasive, car culture windshield bias that is everywhere. And I'm not going to read all this, you don't need to read it, but it's very focused on crossing streets when there's a designated crosswalk. Well, I live in Texas where you can go a half a mile all the time, even in town without having any place to cross. Avoid using electronic devices and be distraction. What I want to draw your attention is the source they use for all these come from a traffic safety stats from NHTSA. These traffic safety facts are like an association of something for people who were killed. So they're the outcomes, they're not the causes. There was no science that said, if you do these things, you could have saved yourself from getting killed. Okay, another criticism. This is from the recent Allies in Action that was announced. This is just a few days ago, 1-year anniversary of the National Road Safety Strategy from the US DOT. I did a little quick word search, all these allies in action. The word encourage was used 6 times. So we'll encourage the adoption of safety-proven countermeasures. We'll encourage safer driving practices. IAHS will encourage utilization of multifaceted interventions, whatever that means. Support, 30 times we've used this word, right? AASHTO, initiatives planned and underway to support developing resources to support implementation. Again, regulate or regulation comes up 0 times in these statements. Mandate 1 time, and even that was under recommendations to mandate. Require 1 time. Kudos to Washington State DOT, who actually said we're going to implement a legislation that requires an approach, much more concrete, actionable item. I recommend going and looking at theirs. I don't know, Barb Chamberlain, please tell me if you were a big part of this or who should get credit, because this is the only ally in action who was super action oriented. Not just a problem at the federal level at the very top. I started making this meme and I couldn't decide, I had to go with 2 of them, right? So state DOTs and MPOs, rather than doing an overhaul, they're spending tons of money on education campaigns, or they're pointing up at the top and kind of a lot of times saying, well, it's not our problem. So here's one example. This is an easy one to pick on. If you're on Twitter, you probably saw this one. Utah DOT, they've got this Move Utah campaign, and they basically said to bicyclists, like, oh, it's below freezing, below 32 Fahrenheit, just don't bike. They weren't giving drivers any similar advice. That's like almost a third of the year in Utah, or at least in Salt Lake City, that happens. They did, to their defense, come back and say, oh, mea culpa, sorry, get out there and bike. But then they didn't give any concrete advice, like, oh, drop the air in your tires a little bit, or go slow, or avoid drivers who are going to be sliding around. We always put the blame. Again, this is a TxDOT campaign on the left here. These people walking around with these absurd signs, again, walk at the signal, even at, that might be a mile between signals. And then this one from Queens, a pedestrian was killed crossing here, be alert, cross with care, as though, again, it's all on the victims. And then traffic safety academics have this too. This is just an example, where they threw out this stat in a recent paper in one of the most prestigious journals, I'd say, AANP, 34 pedestrians killed every year. I was like, well, that seems low, because I stare at these stats all the time. And I looked into it, and they were quoting a Melbourne, Australia metro stat, but the article was about Virginia, where there's 3 times that many deaths per year, and Virginia's in the United States, where there's a huge number of ped deaths per year. And this might seem trivial, but it's, again, this thing where we just kind of normalize, like, oh, we just gloss over these numbers and obscure the real size of the problem. And we have this huge confusion, it seems like, about who does what. Everybody's just kind of, sorry, that's a little blurry. I made it myself, and I'm, again, not that good at memeing, but everybody just seems to be confused about who's responsible. And this came up in a series of tweets, and it's not very pretty to share just tweet screenshots, but Andy Bono, sorry if I said that wrong, Andy, was tweeting about engineers and road space, and the amount of responses that came back from engineers, and not just randos on the internet, but like, David Harwood's like a senior vice principal at a big engineering firm. This other guy is an engineer and a real estate developer. So I'm not just picking on random people. This was a huge number. And they said, oh, well, the speed limit and design speed aren't set by the engineer. It's a planner, or it's not done by the engineer. It's made by a DOT. And it's like, well, wait, who do you think's at a DOT, or who do you think sets the 85th percentile? So there's also a lot of just education in the profession that I think needs to happen. Or over on the left, I was tweeting about an intersection change, and like a local, road safety educator came back and said, oh, well, it's not about planners and engineers at the light. It's about, about drivers. So there's a lot of passing the buck. Okay, so I'm almost at the end here. We can just take a second and all agree and appreciate that this might be the worst diagram you've ever seen. I am not a graphic designer. But what I was attempting to do here is kind of take the hierarchy of controls and the long-standing 5 E's and the inverted pyramid and create something. This is just a draft, but it's, this issue of, oh, should we be talking about drivers and individuals? Should we be talking about systems? And of course, like I said, it's yes and where I think we should agree, of course, a lot of times it's the regulations, particularly when you're talking about all the systems, not just the built environment, where there's a lot, I think, of agreement to be happening. So certainly would love to work with someone on improving this, or if it's even valuable. But this idea that I think at the very lowest, we should be talking, peer to peer, but those things look more like not just education campaigns like I showed, but storytelling and role modeling, maybe some role of shaming and peer-to-peer education. But then also the piece that I think gets missed a lot is the education of focusing on policymakers and practitioners. Okay, so now I've radicalized you, you're in, what does that look like? And this is just one thing I wanted to throw out there as an example I came up with. So if you are someone like you're a middle manager, an upper management person at a city or state DOT, what could you do? So I think reviewing all the internal procedures and policies for some of this, just the language and framing that shifts responsibility and blame onto the less powerful users of the system. It's not that difficult. There's lots of good resources about how to do this, and it's a good first step, right? Something that I would love to study to see if this is impactful or useful, but certainly you could try it tomorrow, is conducting bus, walk, and bike field work, especially if you can partner with local groups and especially with disability groups and others with all levels of staff. So, you can't necessarily require your staff to get to work in different ways, that they might be spread all out and our built environment isn't supportive. But during the workday, are there ways to help staff use our own systems and get out from behind literal windshields, right? Are you exploring using telematics and smart speed management in fleet vehicles? I know this is happening in certain jurisdictions to mixed effect, and I think it needs to be like helping staff understand why that's happening and the role it can play. And when possible, and this is a bigger, longer term issue, stop citing DOTs and planning departments out in these auto-dependent hinterlands where your employees have to drive. And again, you're just reinforcing that windshield bias among employees. And then, I think it matters whether we are good individual drivers and we're making those choices every day, even when we're alone. And when we're talking to staff and when we're having staff meetings, and are we making jokes or are we making little allowances about like, oh, I know everybody, speeds a little, or I know we did this on the way because everybody was late. I think all these little pieces are like little bricks in a wall that make a difference. Okay, and with that, I will wrap up and hopefully we can have some discussion.
All right, thank you so much. We have several questions already lined up, and I'm sure there are going to be more, so just type them in. And
you want me to stop sharing? Sorry.
Yeah, you can stop, and then if we need to go back, you can restart sharing. So let's see. I am going to, it's a little hard to decide where to start. I'll start here with a question or a comment and question from Rick Holt. Would introducing travel, transportation, education in pre-K through 12 support influencing behavior change related to traffic safety? So kids becoming more aware of and understanding the transportation network and different modes of transportation, bike education, walk audits, field trips on transit if available, perhaps connected to intergenerational learning.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Rick. I think there's good evidence, it seems like, from other countries that do this, where they have programs for young kids. They even have licensing, right, in different countries. I remember when I got to go to South Korea when I was working for the city of Davis, and they literally had like a little, like kids got a little bike license that looked like a little driver's license, which was cool, and certainly in the Netherlands. I don't know, and someone who's more of a safe routes to school or school expert can weigh in, or Jennifer may know what the research is. Of course, longitudinal research is hard to see. I think we can look at other things like recycling, where there's some evidence that kids shaming their parents into better behavior. We did do what do you call it, bike rodeos. Like we restarted the bike rodeo program when I was the bike ped coordinator in Davis, which was great, but we didn't do any kind of long-term follow-up to see how that affects. And certainly Fanula Quinn or others who do traffic garden work might have some information on that. But I think, too, it needs to be a multi-pronged effect for it to really be helpful, where, again, looking at the systems level of how do we make the environments around schools safer, and then work with schools to have programs that not only like incentivize biking and walking, but stop disincentivizing or prohibiting biking and walking to school, where they're like, oh, we don't want to be liable, so you kids can't bike and walk, because those are behaviors as well. Like it's all great if you can get kids doing bike education, but if then they can't implement it anywhere else in their life, I don't know that it's going to have lasting effects. So I think, again, like it needs to be on all these multiple levels for it to really have long-term effects. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, I think it does. And you raised a question in your answer about research, and Rick did, in a second question comment in the Q&A box, included a link to an article. I think all of our viewers can see all of the questions, so they can see it there. And if not, I'm gonna hope Becca can maybe put it in the chat. There are a lot of questions here. I'll do another one. How much are the aggressive car stickers baiting, quote unquote, and does it matter? So I think they're referring to, at the beginning of your talk, a lot of these stickers and do we know what the effect of those things are?
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. That's a great question. And I think culture stuff's always complicated, right? And I am not, I'll say it, despite the fact that I talk about this, think about it all this time, I'm not pretending to be a culture expert, and I would love to engage more with sociologists or others who are culture experts. So I'm not necessarily saying there's a direct like causality, or even like that people, I'm certainly not saying that the people who have those stickers are the only ones who are driving who are driving more aggressively or violently on the road. But I do think that all those type of the fact that those exist, and that it's like okay to even have that, like we don't just completely shame or that's an acceptable thing, is part of this larger issue of like kind of normalizing the violence of roadways, right? And I think that I use those, and I called those on purpose, like the egregious examples. So those are things that I think a lot more of us are like, oh, that's kind of like tasteless, or like, that's kind of whatever. But I do think they are part of the spectrum of like things that we kind of just laugh off. And I know, well, Anders probably knows me and knows this stuff well enough, but others might not. It might feel in this talk that I was like cherry picking examples, but I'm not. Like I could give these examples, and I collect this stuff. I could give examples like this for weeks. And so this stuff is just really, really widespread. The question of baiting, I think, is really interesting. I don't know, like, I don't know that there'd be, and certainly I don't think anyone's researched this that I've seen, that like people do that to then provoke others. But it would be an interesting question of like, oh, because we, when we ask people like, have you ever done this? Have you ever cut someone off? Have you ever honked? Like, are they actually responding to that type of thing? I don't know. And especially when you're like driving at speed, I don't think you're really seeing those as much as you are like just in parking lots or stuck in traffic. Whoops, sorry, there's no timer. So yeah, I think there's some interesting question, but to me, it's more about it's like just more drops of water, in the analogy of water being the culture we're all enmeshed with.
Great, thanks. At the very beginning of your talk, you had some statistics, and particularly about pedestrian fatalities or crashes. What about, there's a question about bicycling crashes over the past 2 years, and whether or not those have been increasing in terms of car bicycle crashes.
Yeah. So those crashes have also gone up as well, to that question, and have been going up. So pedestrians and bicyclist crashes have both been going up over the last decade, and every year. The pedestrians, it's just larger numbers generally, but also a horrible public health crisis. And we think they're not exactly the same, but we think a lot of them have a lot of the same causes, right? Bigger cars, worse visibility from those cars, higher speeds, not enough separation. I think with COVID, we may be seeing an effect of, and this is something we just don't have good data on, unfortunately, and there's a lot of data flaws or gaps that I didn't even get to speak to in this talk, but with like essential workers, so who was able to stay home or not stay home during COVID. So some of the numbers we're seeing may reflect like who's traveling and when. But this is not just a COVID issue. Like, these numbers have been going up for a long time. So absolutely, it's a problem. And again, just to tie it back to my larger talk, what's really slowing us down, I'm saying, or the point I'm trying to make, is that all the different ways that we continue to prioritize the car and have this windshield biases, even in very subtle ways that we don't necessarily pick up on in planning and engineering, means that we continue to focus on education campaigns, or we continue to, pat ourselves on the back for saying like, oh, we're allies in action on the road safety strategy, but it's all very like fluffy, not very actionable. Or like Honda, I was criticizing Honda because they're like, oh, we're this ally in action. And they're like, we're going to put all this money in teen driver education campaigns. It's like, well, why don't you just put speed limiters in your vehicles, right? Or smart speed management. Why don't you do interlock ignition in your vehicles? Like, that would be a commitment that actually saved lives. And so, I mean, I know those are extreme examples with like political backlash, but
well, and that relates to another question on here, which at least when the person wrote the question, they said, I didn't hear you mention vehicle design and trends towards human crushing frames. Has this come up in your research, and any thoughts on promising policy strategies for this?
Yeah, so let me see if I can, I don't know if I can see that, but.
Oh, I just cleared it out.
Sorry. Okay, that's fine. No. So yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in vehicle design. I think vehicle design regulation is a huge thing we need to be talking about. And that's why I had that one little meme where I'm like, auto manufacturers are getting a huge pass from our regulators. But that's also because I am myself, a former practitioner of planning and engineering, and I'm now an educator of planners and engineers. That's why I kind of think of that's my lane, sorry. And so it's why I think I'm mostly thinking about how do we get the regulators to regulate auto manufacturers, because that needs to happen, but we need to get the people to actually be willing to regulate, and we need the public support to push for the regulation, etc. So like, for example, I'm one of the studies that we have ongoing, we've published some work out of looking at ADA, advanced driver assistance systems, where we're looking at how they're marketed. And this has been good. It's been in the news lately with like Missy Cummings, formerly of NHTSA. But the way that they're marketed, and marketed as like luxury items, they're not about safety critical, or where they're oversold as safety, where they're named things they shouldn't be. So vehicle design, vehicle tech, and certainly like having the rating systems include, like they do in Europe, ratings that relate to the safety of people outside vehicles. All of those things are super important. And again, could be much faster than saying, let's change all the road design, all the environment, which I'm 100% proponent of. Don't get me wrong in what I'm talking about. It's just that like, we can't just focus on that for the reasons that I mentioned. It's just that today I was really wanting to focus on like planners, engineers, and particular, I'm really trying to talk to, I mean, us, like, well, I say us in lots of different roles, so that's probably confusing. Frontline engineers and planners, it's important, but who I'm really talking to is mid and upper level managers and leaders who really have a lot of power, and I think sometimes are sitting back too much. And I really appreciated Chair Hamady speaking about the leadership that's needed right now in those roles, and I just wanted to echo that.
Building on that a little bit, had a question about public health departments and what their role might be in this.
Yeah, great question. So I think, I've been out of the practitioner world for a while now, but my experience in the practitioner world is one of the challenges of that is you don't always have those relationships and partnerships, partly because of jurisdictions. So a lot of times the public health agencies are at the county level, but then you have like a lot of the transportation planning, agencies at the city level, or, I'm a little bit biased just because that's where I typically worked. So a lot of it is even forming those, but I think in places where they have formed those relationships, or you can form those, coalitions, it's a huge potential for making some change. So like in Multnomah County, they were able to take the work that my colleagues and I did, and I think they worked with Petal Love, Melissa Balmer, and others to do some of this media training, and to not just media, it was public health information officers, public information officers and others to really like like I said in that first bullet of like, what might this look like at an MP or at a DOT? Same thing with this, like public health agencies. What are our own procedures? What are our own language and framing? Like, let's look at our own practices. How could we improve those? So I think public health, and certainly a lot of public health folks already get and have been trained in some of these culture issues and language and framing, but they might not have some of the more, transportation or the engineering and planning background. So this is where the relationships, you're complementary to each other. Rather than trying to become an expert in someone else's field, it's like, no, form these things, and again, where these community partnerships can be really important. Jennifer, do you mind if I answer that one that got sent in ahead of time about enforcement? Because I do think it's really important.
I didn't even see it. I don't know what you're referring to.
Okay.
Sorry.
So it's fine. There was one that got sent in ahead of time where there was like a complete streets project and they were getting a lot of requests from the community to do like police, like having visible police efforts and enforcement, and asking about how to make the connection for people about road design and environment type stuff. And I think that's a really important one. And to that person, I would just say that, really communicating with the local groups that one, the enforcement efforts tend to not work out equitably at all. They, tend to be cause trauma and stress at a minimum for racialized communities, for immigrants, for folks who English isn't their first language, and then often, and not just like with trauma and stress, but in violence for folks. Also important is that I've never seen evidence, and someone can correct me if they've seen it, but I haven't seen evidence that enforcement has lasting effects once it's not there. So you might do some like ticketing at a location where you've seen a lot of like stop sign running, I think was what the person raised, but that the effect might last a week or something, but then after that. So that's where you really need these infrastructure changes. Plus, you don't want to just be reacting or doing something where someone's already there speeding. You want to kind of go further upstream or stop that behavior from even happening. And so I think making that case with a community that, yes, it can feel good in the moment to just be like, oh, let's just get some tickets. I think also that it is worth exploring automated enforcement, which I'm a proponent of if it's done in such a way on that, especially on that horrible diagram that I flashed up for a minute, where it's transparent how the process works. It's not a for-profit thing done by a third party. The money that is raised goes back into that area for traffic safety improvements. It's not like a general fund, moneymaker kind of thing. That can be something that is paired with road design that helps. So that would be my answer to that community.
Great. So I'm just going to say to the audience, we're not going to be able to get to all of the great questions, so I'm apologizing up front for that. I'm going to try to squeeze in sort of combining two that we're getting in at sort of international comparisons. And you did make a couple comments early on about how you only see this in the US, but one question came in about, well, what about Canada and Australia? Because those are more auto-centric places relative to a lot of other countries. So that's part of it. That was one sort of what about other countries question. And why don't you answer that first as I find the other one?
Okay, so I'm sorry, say that again, like because the other community.
Well, what about Canada and Australia? Like, do you see evidence of these types of car culture, et cetera, in those countries?
Yeah, so, and that's something I would like to hear from my Canadian and Australian colleagues, of course. I haven't traveled that extensively in Canada. I have a little bit more in Queensland, in Brisbane, particularly in Australia, which I think is an interesting thing because it's maybe, again, not having traveled anywhere else in Australia, it's maybe the one that's a little bit more similar to the US as far as some of the kind of like frontier spirit, like, there is a little bit more of, I don't know, a little bit more American style. But I think I still never witnessed, and I'm always looking for it again, so I don't think it's just like intentional bias here in the US. I still didn't see nearly kind of the tight connections between the car stuff and some of the like masculinity or violence or some of that. And some of that very well may be because there are pricing things that keep people from having as big of vehicles in small town or in urban spaces, right? So I think these are, again, like I said, really complex interplay between what you can even have. I don't like, and there are, I'm trying to remember who did the study where they were looking at like traffic culture, transportation culture in like 8 different countries. So it's like people have looked at this. Maybe you remember off the top of your head who did that.
I don't, but that sort of answers. There was another question about if you've seen research on sort of comparing car culture in a place like the US versus some Asian countries or European countries that might have a different sense of collectiveness. Maybe.
Yeah, and that is so that's a really good question and something I've been interested in, but I still think there's a lot of more research to be done on this question of like collectivist versus individualist countries and cultures. And certainly like the car itself, like, and I talk about this all the time, like, you know, in the carcoon idea, you know, we are literally isolated from our environments. It's quiet. We control the schedule, we control the climate, we control the music, everything. And so like it just like completely plays into, exacerbates that individual thing. And so we don't use transit as much. We're not like literally in the collective as much. And I don't know that I've seen studies that, and even that one that I mentioned that looks at the 8 different countries or 8 different cultures, I think they're looking at transportation, but they don't dig super deep into some of the stuff I'm talking about related to like masculinity and like identity as much. There's tons of cool research to be done. So for the research geeks on the webinar, like, let's talk. Lots of fun stuff to do.
All right. So thank you very much, Dr. Goddard. I apologize to all of you who had more questions. We could be here for quite a while. We will share all of your questions with Dr. Goddard. Before we all leave, and I want to thank our speaker, and then I also want to thank all of you for attending. And there will be a very short questionnaire after you log off. We always appreciate your feedback for our future events. So with that, we're calling it a day. Good afternoon, and thanks a lot, Tara.
Thanks, everybody.